The UPDRS, or the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, is a really good thing to be aware of. As a person with Parkinson's, as a caregiver, as a movement professional, physiotherapist, knowledge of the UPDRS is actually very helpful for all of us, right? As you go through this and we look at what they examine, you'll see why this can be helpful, where you can just gain more knowledge about this and how people may be affected. Okay, so it's a UPDRS combines elements of several scales to produce a comprehensive and flexible tool to monitor the course of Parkinson's and the degree of disability. This scale was introduced in 1987. Since 1987, it's been updated by many specialists from the Movement Disorder Society. And the updates include new assessments of non-motor symptoms, because we know that these can be very, very debilitating. For example, you may have a tremor, you may be in a wheelchair, but that's not necessarily going to stop you from going on vacation, right? Because you can take your wheelchair, they can wheel you onto the plane, put you in a seat, and there you go. Well, what if you have a hallucination or delusion that is so scary, so frightening, so debilitating that you won't leave the house, and nobody can get you to leave the house? Well, you know, this is actually something that's very common. It's very sad, and that's why these additions to the UPDRS to include assessments for non-motor symptoms are so important. All right, depression, treatments for depression. We have another slide where we talk about depression and falls and depression. And then there's the, what causes what? Well, they probably both cause each other, but when you add in the side effects of antidepressants, we realize that the fall risk goes up because of those side effects. So it's really, really interesting. We'll go through the slides about UPDRS after this little intro slide here. The scale has 3 sections which evaluate key areas of disability, and together with a 4th section, we are now able to evaluate complications of treatment. This is a game changer. It's good stuff to know. As we get started, just want to let you know that you can have access to this particular rating scale in the resources section on the website. All right, so part 1 of the UPDRS is going to evaluate mental activity, behavior, and mood. So that would include things like, let's say, cognitive impairment or intellectual impairment, because we do know that cognitive decline oftentimes, most of the time, by some point in the progression of the disease, it will accompany the disease. Thought disorder, motivation or initiative. We know with lack of dopamine, a lot of times there's less motivation or initiative to get out and do anything or get up and do anything. Depression, we already talked about it. Number 1 non-motor symptom. Sleep issues are oftentimes an issue. Okay, we talked about pain. It's very often present but underdiagnosed and not treated oftentimes. Bladder problems, yes. Bowel problems, constipation is huge. Many times side effects from medications. And fatigue is another thing that is common. Part 2 is the self-evaluation of activities of daily living. So these are all motor related. Okay, speech, salivation. We didn't talk about that yet, but salivation is something that is a problem for some people. Swallowing can be a problem. In fact, choking is something we're concerned about as well, because the ability to swallow is sometimes impaired, and that can be very dangerous. Micrographia, that would be where handwriting is compromised basically because they're writing so small. Things like cutting food. There's a motor skill that we didn't talk about yet, right? So we talked about dressing, like buttons, zippers. Well, cutting food, a slip of a knife can be dangerous. Personal hygiene, sometimes that's neglected. Rolling over in bed. That's a big one. We have a whole section on rolling patterns, and we're going to talk about that in great detail when we get there. Falling, already talked about it. Freezing, walking or gait, tremor. And as we mentioned before, but I'm going to repeat this one because it's very, very important. Diminished sense of smell is very common in Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and many movement disorders. So my words of wisdom here are, if you or anyone you know starts to notice yourself or you notice somebody else has a diminished sense of smell, maybe something's burning in the kitchen and it's like, oh, you can smell it, but they don't smell it, it's time to go to the doctor. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean you have a motor disorder, a motor problem, or I should say a neurological disorder. However, it's also, as we discussed in the early symptoms, this can be one of the earliest symptoms, loss of sense of smell. So that's something, if you experience it or anyone you know of is experiencing, get to the doctor, and if the doctor doesn't take you seriously, go to another doctor. So again, we're looking at some things we've talked about previously, but this is part of the UPDRS. So we're looking at part 3 of that scale is evaluation of motor function. So we see speech popping up again, top of the list, facial expressions, tremor at rest. So resting tremor is just somebody sitting or laying down, and is there a tremor anywhere? And if so, what would the action of the tremor be? Rigidity is basically its stiffness. Finger taps, also hand movements. So I look at finger taps a couple of different ways. Sometimes in very, very early motor symptom stage, you see the first sign of tremor being maybe just the index finger just tapping on something, if you can hear this. Right? My finger's just tapping on the desk very lightly. I know of many people who that's the very first symptom they had. But then there's also the finger taps of the intentional finger taps. Can you tap your fingers together? Can you coordinate? All right. Hand movements. What type of control do you have over your hands? Rotation of the hands and forearms so the palms face downwards. And then, of course, the opposite where they face upwards. Toe taps. How's the agility of the legs? Are they able to rise from a chair and get back down okay? That's part of something we do in a neurological assessment called the TUG test, timed up and go test. Posture, what does the posture look like? How's their walking? How's their gait? How's the stride? How's the symmetry? Is it stride length? Is that symmetrical? Is the stride rhythmically symmetrical? Or are they shuffly? And then, of course, we have postural instability, which we talked about in the motor section when we discussed that is responsible for more falls than the other motor symptoms put together. All right, and bradykinesia, that would be slowness of movement. So, part 3, evaluation of motor function. We're looking at all of these things. In part 4, we're evaluating the complications of therapy. Dyskinesia is like an uncontrolled set of movements. Basically, if you look at Michael J. Fox, I remember seeing him interviewed here not too long ago where he was moving uncontrollably, and the host of the show said, "I can see that you're not on your meds." And he said, "No, I am on my meds." He says, "Well, why are you moving so much?" He says, "Well, I'd rather be moving like this uncontrollably with dyskinesia than to be frozen and not able to do anything." So that's something we would look at here is the treatment causing a dyskinesia. And sometimes that can be adjusted so it's less dyskinesia but still not freezing. Early morning, that can be tough, man. I can tell you, we don't do Parkinson's classes early in the morning because typically that's not a good time. They've got to get up, they've got to get going, and then, well, actually it would be an off period, right? So once they take a medication and it kicks in, it might be more like mid-morning before they're ready to go, many times. Remember, we're generalizing here. So the off-period deterioration, including the duration of off periods. So when we look at that, we're basically looking at dopamine replacement therapy, which would be levodopa, carbidopa, Sinemet. Those are medications that you can take that help to replace the dopamine that's lacking in the brain. We talked about this in another slide, in another point in the program, and I'm going to repeat it here because it's very important that how fast someone gets from an off period to on is one thing we can look at. How long are they on? In other words, moving well, excuse me. And then how fast do they crash from being on? How fast do they go from on to off? And you're going to find that this varies with every person, and it's just something to be aware of. And of course, this is part of this UPDRS. Anorexia, nausea or vomiting. I don't see a lot of this, but it's something that is on this to be assessed because it does happen. And once again, we see sleep disturbance popping up for the umpteenth time in this program because it is so often an issue.